So you want to learn about ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, and I can't blame you because in my opinion, these are the most exciting things to come from the .NET and ASP.NET teams in a very long time, and it's primarily for two reasons. The first is that they are cross-platform, the second is that you can use whatever code editor that you want. Now let me first of all say that if you are on Windows, and if you plan on writing ASP.NET Core using Visual Studio, you will get some things out of this series. However, I'm going to be focusing on writing ASP.NET Core applications using something other than Visual Studio, and I'm going to be using the command line tools. So if you are on some other platform, what you see on screen is going to be Windows, but you can run the same exact commands and get the same results. And in some of the future videos, I'm going to switch between Windows and Mac, just to have a little variety. So you want to go to Microsoft.com/net, and then you want to download the .NET Core SDK for your operating system. Now, I have not installed it on Linux, and there are several distributions available, so I can't really comment on the process there. However, I have installed it on a Mac, and all you have to do is just follow these instructions, and you will get .NET Core SDK on your computer. But since I'm on Windows, just download that installer. It doesn't take very long to install it. In fact, it's just a few seconds. And after you do install it, then you just need a code editor. Now, I am going to be using Visual Studio Code, which is cross-platform as well, and it's an editor similar to Atom, Brackets, and Sublime Text. However, it does have some of the features that you would expect from something with Visual Studio in its name. Like there is IntelliSense, and you can also debug your applications, but I'm not going to be doing any of that, at least starting off. Now, if you do choose to use Visual Studio Code, you also want to install the C# extension. And you can do that inside of Visual Studio Code. Just pull up the command palette on Windows, that's Control-Shift-P. I assume it is Command-P on a Mac. And then hit backspace to get rid of that caret, and you want to do ext, install, and then C#. Whenever you press enter, it's going to search and find all of the extensions that have to do with C#. The one on the top that just says C#, that's the one that you want to install. Just click on it or click on the install, and then you will need to restart code and you will be good to go. Now, the next thing that we need to do is create our first project, and we do so by creating a directory, and then we call a .NET command inside of that directory. Now, you can of course create your folders using your operating system's user interface. However, since we need to execute some commands, it just makes sense to do that in the console. So I'm going to call my folder my first app. You can call it whatever you want to. And then we want to cd into that folder. We want to call .NET space new, and this is going to create a new C# project. And if we look at the contents, we see two files. There's program.cs, which is the code for our program, and then there's project.json, which has some information about our program, as well as the dependencies that our program needs. Now, if we try to run this with .NET space run, we're going to run into an error. It said that the expected lock file doesn't exist, and it tells us what that is, project.lock.json. Now, we can create this by running another .NET command. It's simply .NET space restore. This is going to look at project.json, and it's going to pull in all of the dependencies that are listed there, but it's also going to pull in all of the stuff that's needed from .NET Core in order to compile and run the application. And we can see that all of the packages have been restored. Now, we didn't specify any packages, but we will here in a few moments. And we can also see that the lock file is written to disk, and that the restore completed. So now if we do .NET run, we're going to see our application run. Now, this is a console application. In fact, all .NET Core apps are console apps, and that makes sense because .NET Core is cross-platform. If these were graphical applications, then all of that stuff would have to be abstracted for the operating system, and that might eventually come, but I imagine that .NET Core apps are just going to be console apps. Now, this also means that ASP.NET Core applications are console apps as well. I know that that seems kind of weird, but here in a few moments, we're going to see the code that's actually going to start up an ASP.NET application. Okay, so let's look at the code here. Now we have the program.cs file, which is our code, and right now it's just writing something to the console. And if you're using code, you're going to see this message: do you want to pull in the assets for debugging? And yeah, sure, why not? So we are writing a message to the console, and let's just change this up very quickly. Let's say enter your name, and then we're going to read the console. So let's say var name equals console.readLine, and then we're going to output that. So we'll say console write line, and we'll say hello, and we're going to use the new string interpolation features in C#6, and we're just going to say hello name. And so if we run this, we're going to see our application has actually changed. So once again, we'll go back to the command line. We do .NET run. It's going to see that the source code changed, so it's going to recompile, and then it says enter your name. And our name is Jeremy, and then it says hello Jeremy. Now, since we're here, let's look at the resulting binary, because you might think that this is a console application, it's an executable, but that's not the case. You can see that we have this bin folder, and if we dive deeper, there's debug, and then there's NetCore app 1.0, and then we have myfirstapp.dll. These .NET Core applications are DLLs, and once again that makes sense because these are cross-platform. We should be able to write these applications on any operating system, compile it, and then deploy it on Windows, Linux, Mac, or Docker. And if we were compiling to an executable, that would be rather difficult. But since we're compiling to a DLL, well, then we can rely upon the runtime installed on that computer to load the DLL in order to execute our application. So that's why we have DLLs instead of executables. Well, let's change our application so that it is an ASP.NET application. The first thing we need to do is open up project.json, and we need to add a dependency for Kestrel, which is Microsoft's high-performance and cross-platform web server. So inside of dependencies here, we're going to say microsoft.aspnetcore.server.kestrel, and then the version is 1.0.0. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about project.json or project.lock.json because these files are eventually going to go away. I don't know if you paid attention, but whenever you downloaded the SDK, you probably saw the phrase preview 2 in the installer. Now that might seem strange because .NET Core is supposed to be final, and it is, but the tooling is still in preview. And the project.json and project.lock.json are part of the tooling. So these are going to go away, and instead we're going to have just the normal CSproj files, which we have had for C# projects since the very beginning. But we can see here that project.lock.json has a lot in it. And basically what happens is whenever you run .NET Restore, it's going to look at the dependencies in project.json, which we now have one inside of this dependencies object here, but there's also another one here for NetCore app 1. And whenever you run the restore command, it's going to load all of those dependencies and add them to this project.lock.json. So you can think of project.json as a higher level of what your application needs, and then project.lock.json has all of the detail for your application. Okay, so we have added Kestrel to our dependencies. Let's go ahead and run the restore command. So let's do .NET restore, and that is going to add in the Kestrel dependency. So we can go back to our program.cs. We need a few using statements. The first is going to be Microsoft.ASP.NETCore.Builder. And we can go ahead and copy and paste that a couple more times because we still need Microsoft.ASP.NETCore.Hosting and then .HTTP. So now we need to create our host and run it. But we're still going to do kind of this thing here. We're going to prompt for the user's name and then we are going to retrieve the user's name, and then we are going to display the user's name in the web browser. So it's really not going to be useful, but it's going to show the relationship between the console application and then the ASP.NET application as well. And I say that as two different things, when really an ASP.NET application is this console app. So the first thing we need is our host, and we're going to new up a class called Web Host Builder. We use this class in order to build our host, as if that wasn't self-explanatory by its name. So the first thing we want to do is say that we want to use the Kestrel server. And then we're going to call a method called configure. Now, normally we wouldn't call this configure method. Instead, we would use a method called useStartup. And then we would specify a startup class that would then have everything that's needed to configure the application. But for this starter application, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the configure method. And the configure method accepts a delegate, and that delegate accepts an object of iApplicationBuilder. So our Lambda expression is going to have an iApplicationBuilder object called app. We're going to use this app in order to configure our application to respond to requests. And we do that with the apps method called run. And this run method is going to accept the HTTP context, but this is also going to be asynchronous. So we have context, that is our HTTP context that we get to work with inside of this Lambda expression. And we want to await context response, and we are going to write async, and then we are going to say hello, and then whatever name was specified. So basically the same thing that we did before. It's just that this is going to be displayed within the browser as opposed to the console window. So that's all that we are going to do, except that now we need to build our host. So we call the build method, and then once we have built our host, we want to run it. So that's going to be our code for this example. We want to go back to our console, and let's do .NET run, and we are going to be prompted to enter our name. So I'm going to put in my name, and now we can see that we have a hosting environment. It is production. We are now listening on port 5000 of localhost. So let's hop on over to the browser. Let's do localhost. Helps if you type that correctly. And then we should see Hello Jeremy in the browser. So now we have an ASP.NET Core application, but it's not an MVC application. And that's because we did not include the MVC dependencies, and we did not configure our application to use MVC. But we will do so in the next video.